objectives, the project seeks to assess the current productivity environment in the country and to develop a framework and a roadmap to be implemented by public and private sector entities so as to significantly improve the country's productivity indices. Focus in the TOR is placed on measurement of productivity and initiatives designed to foster improved productivity. So this Global Best Practice Report, gap analysis and recommendations highlights the areas of improvement that are most critically needed in the Jamaican context if improved productivity outcomes are to be realized. Now, the recommendations were derived through a process of reviewing the existing theoretical and empirical literature on the recent trends affecting productivity, measurement, and performance. We conducted a multi-pronged situational assessment of Jamaica's past economic performance, or performance in key productivity measures over time, and relative to a set of comparator countries, and of factors affecting that performance. We also assessed the global trends in productivity, management, measurement, and policies. And so the gaps were identified by comparing GOJ policies, initiatives, and plans with the global lessons learned. And bear in mind that the countries that we selected as comparators were countries of a similar size or income level as Jamaica, but which had registered notable productivity progress and were from different regions of the world. So from Africa, we had Botswana and Mauritius. From Latin America, we had Peru. From the Caribbean, we included the Dominican Republic and Trinidad and Tobago. And from Europe, there was Malta. And as an aspirational comparator, we also included Singapore. So colleagues, the results indicate that there are two broad areas that must be targeted if improved productivity outcomes are to be realized. And those are highlighted on the screen there. Improving the measurement, monitoring, and management of productivity, as well as identifying and cohesively addressing the binding constraints to productivity. Let us put a little bit of context to it by looking at our performance and progress in productivity. So historically, the World Bank notes that for the entire period of 1960 to 2000, Jamaica's total factor productivity growth was estimated at negative 0.5% per annum. Comparatively, the World Bank notes that our total factor productivity lags significantly behind most countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region. The figure that is highlighted on the screen shows that Jamaica has below average performance relative to the comparator countries in the measure of total factor productivity. As at 2019, Jamaica was below the median position relative to the comparator countries and had consistently declining total factor productivity since 2000. This figure, colleagues, showed that Jamaica's annual labor productivity growth for the period 2001 to 2022 has been predominantly negative. The JPC estimates that labor productivity has decreased at an average rate of 0.9% per year since 2001. And when we compare this to the countries utilized in the study as key comparators, Jamaica had the lowest GDP per person employed in 2021. All but one of the comparator countries had ratios that were at least double that of Jamaica's. And Jamaica was the only country of the group for which the GDP per person employed in 2021 was less than that in the year 2000. When we break this down by sector, we see that in 8 of the 12 sectors for which the JPC provided data, output per worker for the period starting January 2023 was lower than that of January 2012. So even over this period of more than a decade, colleagues, only marginal increases in labor productivity were registered in manufacturing and agriculture, forestry, and fishing. Capri notes that of the 4 sectors that registered increases in productivity, in only 2 did employment simultaneously increase. So the implication is that in 2 of the 4 industries where productivity increased, jobs were lost, not created. Then, colleagues, it's clear, therefore, that we need to look at what are the binding constraints to improve productivity in Jamaica. And to identify these binding constraints, an iterative approach was adopted. First, the literature was reviewed to highlight the constraints to productivity identified internationally and to develop a long list of constraints. This was narrowed down through a review of previous studies on Jamaica, which allowed for a tracing of the evolution of constraints to productivity identified from pre-independence to present. Constraints to productivity which have persisted over time and remain pertinent in Jamaica were thus highlighted. Then, using secondary data trend and comparative analysis, a short list of the binding constraints in the to productivity in Jamaica were next developed. And to do this, the scores given to Jamaica by international bodies and local entrepreneurs across numerous of the previously identified constraints were first assessed. So these colleagues aided in identifying which of the constraints are currently perceived as most pressing. So Jamaica's performance in these specific areas were then compared over time and against the performance of the comparator countries. And this is to ascertain whether Jamaica's performance in these areas relative to the comparators is below par, further making the case for their inclusion as binding constraints. It's a bit small, but this table summarizes a review of the studies that have identified constraints to productivity in the Caribbean, in Latin America and the Caribbean region, and in sub-Saharan Africa, along with the countries selected as comparators. And when we examine the findings, there are clear similarities across countries and regions, particularly for the first 7 constraints listed. We should realize, though, that as we proceed further down the list, it was evident that the productivity constraints faced are dependent on the specific location and time being considered. It is therefore necessary to narrow down the long list of constraints that we identified to consider those that are most applicable in the Jamaican context. And to do this, we reviewed studies on productivity in Jamaica spanning an 80-year period from pre-independence to 2022. So the figure on the screen captures the evolution in the constraints to productivity in Jamaica that have been identified in studies conducted over the past 80 years. So whereas dynamism has been exhibited in that issues such as macroeconomic instability, affordable finance, high taxes, adversarial industrial relations, performance incentives have diminished in importance, other constraints have been shown to be remarkably intractable. So for example, the consistent dominance of low-skilled and improperly educated labor as a constraint to productivity in Jamaica is indisputable. The concentration in low-value added activities and industries, while only recently gaining dominance, is also shown to have been consistently identified as a constraint to productivity from even the pre-independence period. And while the types of industries that the Jamaican economy has specialized in may have changed over the years, the nature of those industries continue to exhibit a concentration in low value added activities. It's not surprising, therefore, that the low level of innovativeness and technology adoption has been consistently identified as a constraint to productivity. Also noteworthy is that since the late 1980s, the costs of crime and security have also consistently been featured as a significant constraint to productivity in the country. And finally, while some improvements have been made to the business environment in Jamaica, certain specific costs of doing business in the country remain inhibitive to productivity. So those identified in the most recent studies include customs and trading across borders, bureaucracy, red tape, challenges with the general infrastructure. Okay, so having seen the review of studies that has indicated a narrowing over time of the constraints to productivity in Jamaica, we then delved more deeply into the available secondary data to ascertain whether trend and comparative data analysis confirms this narrowing and thus can concretize the existence of a current short list of constraints to productivity in the country. So we started with the Global Competitiveness Index, which captures the microeconomic and macroeconomic foundations of national competitiveness, which is important to the level of productivity in the country. The figure on the screen presents the 20 GCI subcomponent indicators for which Jamaica received the lowest scores. Noteworthy is the fact that whereas the best possible score was 7, you'll see on the screen that Jamaica scored 3.6 or below in all of the areas highlighted. So of these 20 low scoring areas, 5 were related to the education and skill level of the labor force. 5 were related to crime and corruption. 4 were related to inadequacies in the innovation ecosystem. 1 to the burden of customs procedures, and 1 to the extent of market dominance. Now, this figure shows the breakout of the Global Innovation Index pillars into the subcomponent indicators. It reveals that the 5 lowest GII scores received by Jamaica in 2022 were all in areas related to the innovation ecosystem, with research and development and knowledge creation being closely linked inputs to the ecosystem, along with the availability of suitable investment products Online creativity and creative goods and services are critical outputs from the innovation ecosystem, and very low scores in all of these areas highlight the existing inadequacies in the area. You'll note from the graph that the 6th, the 7th, the 9th, and the 10th lowest GII scores received are all in areas related to the education and skill level of the labor force. So colleagues, I don't need to say to this group that without quality education at all levels, the Jamaican economy will find it impossible to have knowledge diffusion and impact, will not achieve a proliferation of knowledge workers, and this in turn affects the likelihood of innovation linkages and knowledge absorption. Also noteworthy is the fact that the 11th lowest GI score was received in the area of trade, diversification, and market scale. This was also the indicator in which Jamaica registered the largest reduction in score between 2015 and 2022, meriting an investigation into whether this decline was solely precipitated by the COVID-19 pandemic, or whether issues with economic diversification and complexity are binding constraints, as many of the previous review studies had indicated. We also drew on the Innovation for Performance and Gender Survey conducted by Complete Caribbean in 2020 and 2021. So on the screen, we have the views of Jamaican business operators on the most serious obstacles affecting the operations of their establishments. Results indicate that the largest proportion of Jamaican business operators identify the inadequately educated workforce as the most serious obstacle affecting their operations. This is followed by corruption in second place and crime, theft, and disorder in fourth place. Electricity was the third most frequently identified constraint. Now, rounding out the top 5 most serious obstacles frequently identified by Jamaican business operators is customs and trade regulations in the pre-COVID period and access to digital payment channels during and after COVID. Note, however, that the decline in the number of businesses identifying customs and trade regulations may be a matter of the timing of the questionnaire, as many businesses experience significant reductions in cross-border transactions during COVID. This would likely have reverted to pre-COVID levels with the removal of the COVID restrictions, and with it, the expected resurgence in the importance of constraints affecting cross-border trade. So the reviews of the studies on the Jamaican economy and the comparison across indices and business surveys yield similar conclusions as to what should constitute a short list of constraints to productivity in Jamaica that are likely to be binding in the current context. The recurring constraints that are the prime tenets for the list are those listed on the screen: the education and skill level of the labor force, crime and corruption, inadequacies in the innovation ecosystem, limited economic diversification, complexity and structural transformation, and specific costs of doing business. And so what we did next in our study was to analyze each of these constraints to productivity, with Jamaica's performance and key indicators being assessed over time and being benchmarked against the comparator countries. Now, colleagues, in the interest of time, I have not reproduced all of the graphs and analyses that are included in the report. Instead, what I have done here, and for each of the constraints, is to pull highlights of the most glaring areas of poor performance relative to the comparator countries and worsening performance over time. Remember, we're looking for binding constraints. So for education and skill level, we found that Jamaica registered the lowest score of all the comparator countries in the Penn World Table's Human Capital Index. This index utilizes a narrow measure of human capital, focusing on average years of schooling and an assumed rate of return to education. It's therefore not surprising that Jamaica had the fewest number of years of compulsory education, the second lowest number of expected years of school, with the second largest decline in this number between 2017 and 2020, the third smallest learning adjusted years of school, with the second largest decline in this variable between 2017 and 2020. Exacerbating this issue is the fact that Jamaica had the highest out-of-school rate among the comparator countries for which data were available for children at the primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary levels. At the primary level, the out-of-school rate for Jamaica was more than 4 times larger than that of the closest comparator country. And at the lower secondary level, it was more than 3 times larger. With regards to the quality of education being received, the Jamaica Education Transformation Commission, the 2021 report, notes, and I quote, Jamaica has a severe learning crisis, that a majority of students at the end of primary school remain illiterate and innumerate, and most leave secondary school with no marketable skills. The report further notes that girls substantially outperform boys in all examinations, with the gender disparity widening at each level of the system. Jamaica also had the lowest score in 2022 for tertiary education on the Global Innovation Index relative to the comparator countries. Jamaica's score in this measure has been steadily declining since 2015. It's therefore not surprising then, colleagues, that as of 2020, Jamaica had the second lowest proportion of its working population with advanced education, which was lower in 2020 than it was in 2010, and received the second lowest score on the GII for knowledge workers, which was significantly lower in 2022 than it was in 2015. When were surveyed in 2020 and 2021, the results indicate that Jamaican firms had the second lowest ratio of skilled to unskilled workers among the Caribbean small states. They attributed this skill shortage in their establishments primarily to the quality of the education and training offered by local educational institutions and to the shortage in the number of local professionals trained by local institutions. And of course, this is all exacerbated by the relatively high immigration rates from the country. For crime and corruption, we saw that the rates of intentional homicide in Jamaica have dwarfed those of the comparator countries, and they've been worsening over time. Almost a third of Jamaican businesses experience losses because of theft, robbery, vandalism, or arson. Because of crime, almost 80% of Jamaican businesses were forced to spend money for security. This was the largest proportion of businesses from the sample of Caribbean countries in which the survey was conducted. Almost 2/3 of Jamaican businesses indicated that they had to make irregular additional payments to public officials. Jamaica was the second worst performer with respect to the WGI's rule of law estimate. And this measure captures the perceptions of the extent to which agents have confidence in and abide by the rules of society, and in particular the quality of contract enforcement, property rights, the police, and the courts, as well as the likelihood of crime and violence. So an important part, colleagues, of ensuring, an important part of ensuring confidence in the rule of law relates to increasing transparency in transactions and in reducing the costs associated with enforcing contracts. Now, Jamaica faces numerous challenges in this regard. We have the second lowest extent of disclosure index, the highest attorney fees for enforcing contracts, the highest court fees for enforcing contracts, the third highest enforcement fees for enforcing contracts, the highest overall cost of enforcing contracts, and the third longest time taken for trial and judgment in cases involving enforcement of contracts. Now, if we look at inadequacies in the innovation ecosystem, thank you very much. The Global Innovation Index, the GII, utilizes the innovation ecosystem approach to rank countries by their capacity for and their success in innovation. It focuses on 5 innovation inputs and 2 innovation outputs. So what we have done in the report, in the section on the innovation ecosystem, is to highlight the aspects of the innovation ecosystem in which Jamaica has performed relatively poorly, which are not addressed in other sections of the report. So important elements of the innovation ecosystem that are addressed in other sections of the report include human capital and research, knowledge workers, trade diversification and market scale, knowledge absorption, knowledge workers, etc. The remaining elements of the innovation ecosystem where inadequacies have been identified for Jamaica relate to infrastructure, particularly ICTs and ecological sustainability, market sophistication, particularly investment, and innovation outputs, looking at knowledge and technology outputs as well as creative outputs. And so on the screen, we see that Jamaica received the lowest ICT score of the comparator countries in 2022. Now that might be surprising because you know that Jamaica has made some progress in ICT. When we dug deeper, we found that although Jamaica improved its scores in ICT access, in online e-participation, in ICT use, and in the government's online services between 2015 and 2022, Jamaica's positioning relative to the comparator countries had not changed, with some comparator countries registering much greater improvements than Jamaica did. Although the country ranked among the highest for usage of mobile phones, social media, websites, with about 40% of Jamaican firms not utilizing websites, and 30% not using social media, clearly there is room for improvement in these areas as well. And this is clearly reflected in the data, which show that on average, only just under 13% of purchases by Jamaican firms were conducted through e-commerce. Another area of the innovation ecosystem which Jamaica performed relatively poorly was with respect to ecological sustainability. As at 2022, Jamaica had the second lowest score for ecological sustainability. The score in 2022 was also significantly lower than it was in 2015, and this is because in 2022, Jamaica's energy efficiency had worsened relative to 2015 and remained significantly below that of the non-oil producing comparators. And because the country's score on the Environmental Performance Index had worsened significantly also between 2015 and 2022. Market sophistication in the GII focuses on credit, investment, and trade diversification and market scale. So trade diversification and market scale will be addressed in a subsequent section. So Jamaica's overall score for market sophistication in 2021 was the second lowest among the comparative countries. And the score in 2021 was significantly lower than it was in 2015. Interestingly, Jamaica's poor performance in market sophistication overall is not due to the availability of and access to credit. As at 2021, Jamaica had the fourth highest GII score for credit. The trend over time also indicates consistently improving performances up to 2021. So although there remains room for improvement in the areas of financial inclusion and the affordability of credit, the country's efforts in those areas have yielded meaningful results. It's important to note, though, colleagues, that credit may not always be the most suitable financing instrument for innovative projects. And this is why the GII also places emphasis on investments. And in this regard, Jamaica has performed relatively poorly with the third lowest GII score for investments in 2021 and with inconsistent performance over the period. So, colleagues, with the inadequacies in the Jamaican innovation inputs, it's not surprising that the country also underperforms in its production of innovation outputs. So as at 2021, Jamaica ranks third lowest among the comparative countries for knowledge and technology outputs, lowest for creative goods and services, and third lowest for online creative. Jamaica has also performed poorly on all indicators that focus on economic diversification and structural transformation. As at 2021, Jamaica received the lowest score among the comparative countries in the GII's Trade Diversification and Market Scale Index, with a significantly worsening performance over the review period. The country also had a score in 2022 for structural change on UNCTAD's Productive Capacities Index. And the PCI measures structural change as a movement of labor and other productive resources from low productivity to high productivity economic activities. Among the comparative countries for which data were available, Jamaica had the second highest HH market concentration index in 2020 and the highest product concentration index of exports in 2021. The Economic Complexity Index, ECI, assumes that countries accumulate productive knowledge by developing the capacity to make a larger variety of products of increasing complexity. Results indicate that as of 2020, only 2 comparative countries had a smaller ECI than Jamaica. The Complexity Outlook Index captures the ease of diversification for our country. So a low complexity outlook, or COI, reflects that a country will find it difficult to acquire new know-how and increase their economic complexity. The data indicate that Jamaica's COI has been consistently negative over the review period, and as at 2020 was the second lowest among the comparative countries. So, colleagues, the concept and the measure of economic complexity is based fundamentally on the amount of productive knowledge that each country holds. So we have already highlighted the challenges that Jamaica faces with respect to the education and skill level of its labor force, which has adversely impacted its knowledge workers' score on the GII. It's not surprising then that Jamaica's GII scores on knowledge creation, knowledge diffusion, knowledge impact are all relatively low and have worsened since 2015. This, colleagues, has implications for the extent to which the country can produce innovative, patentable outputs and publishable research, high-tech manufacturing and exports, ICT service exports, etc. So the competitiveness and the growth potential of the country's exports have been stymied by the low complexity and low value-added nature of the industries and the activities in which they are concentrated. This in turn has precluded significantly improved productivity performance. In terms of the fifth and final binding constraint, specific costs of doing business. We want to start first here by acknowledging that the government of Jamaica has dedicated considerable effort and resources towards improvements in the business environment in the country. Meaningful improvements in several areas have resulted. Notwithstanding this, a few critical areas remain problematic and act as constraints to productivity in the economy. Results of the secondary data analysis have revealed that two remaining critical costs of doing business, which have not been covered in other sections of the report, are related to electricity as well as trading across borders. The PCI score for energy measures the availability, sustainability, and efficiency of power sources. Jamaica had the second lowest score among the comparator countries in this indicator in 2022. There's been a worsening performance in this indicator over time as well. Jamaican businesses face the largest number of procedures and the second longest time to get electricity relative to the comparator countries. They also pay the highest price for electricity among the comparator countries as of 2020. So colleagues, these costs, along with issues surrounding sustainability and reliance on fossil fuel and the current electricity supply infrastructure, highlight why electricity remains a significant constraint to productivity in Jamaica. The Logistics Performance Index measures countries' performance on trade logistics and hence is a good reference point when examining the costs and inefficiencies highlighted with trading or associated with trading across borders. Jamaica had the joint lowest score among the comparators in the 2023 edition of the LPI. When we examined the breakdown of the LPI score, we found that Jamaica had the lowest score among comparator countries for efficiency of the clearance process by border control agencies, including customs, for quality of trade and transport-related infrastructure, for example, your ports, your railroads, roads, etc., for timeliness of shipments in reaching destination within the scheduled or expected delivery time. Jamaica also had the second lowest score among the comparator countries for competence and quality of logistics services, for example, transport operators, customs brokers. Jamaica had the third lowest score among the comparator countries for ability to track and trace consignments and for ease of arranging competitively priced shipments. And so, colleagues, the implications of all of this is that the costs of border compliance for Jamaican exports and imports were significantly higher than they were for any of the comparator countries. All right, let me pause here to take a sip of water and to allow you to catch your breath, because I realize you came in this morning looking all perky and happy. But after this segment of the presentation, some of you look quite depressed. So let me just pause 1 second. So having highlighted the binding constraints and the depth of the binding constraints, the aim of the gap analysis conducted in the study was to identify the policy gaps that must be filled for widespread improved productivity performance to be realized in Jamaica. I want to start here by acknowledging that the government of Jamaica has explicitly pursued improved productivity performance in the private and the public sectors through the activities of the Jamaica Productivity Center. The JPC has sought to encourage the measurement and monitoring of productivity through the computation and dissemination of national and sectoral productivity data, and through a range of public education trusts. They've also sought to foster improved management for productivity through enterprise productivity support and research and provision of consultancy and training services. The GOJ, often with the support of its international development partners, IDPs, has also implemented numerous initiatives and programs that have explicitly targeted improved productivity in MSMEs, in certain sectors of the economy, and in specific government ministries, departments, and agencies. Improved productivity outcomes have also been implicitly pursued by the GOJ through efforts to address binding constraints to productivity in the country. So for each of the 5 binding constraints, colleagues, this report has reviewed policies and plans and several initiatives designed by the government of Jamaica and its international development partners to address them. So although it was beyond the scope of this report to conduct intensive policy evaluations and impact assessments in any of these areas, from the cursory reviews conducted, it was clear that the government of Jamaica is aware of and has implemented multiple measures that seek to address all the binding constraints to productivity. So then that leaves this important question. If all of this has been done, why have the desired outcomes not been achieved? That is a critical question. So the gap analysis sought to answer this question by identifying the gaps in the productivity enhancing interventions undertaken by the government. For each key area of focus, an assessment was conducted to ascertain whether the GOJ's plans, policies, initiatives identified the critical problem areas and sought to address them in a manner consistent with global lessons learned. And so the table highlights the summary of the results. The big check mark means fully, the small check mark means partially. So under the focal area of measuring, monitoring, and managing productivity, the gap analysis showed that measures of productivity at the national and sectoral levels are, for the most part, being computed to international standards. Existing challenges have been identified by the JPC, but to date, some of the solutions do not fully adhere to the most rigorous methods of measurement. This has resulted in some measures of productivity not being computed for some sectors. There's also a need to review the current methods being utilized by Tennant to measure output, particularly in the services sector, to ascertain whether they adhere to best practices. But colleagues, the most glaring gap resides with the measurement of productivity in the public sector. With only output per worker for the producers of government services computed, there are gaps in the provision of more rigorous macro measures of productivity for the public sector. Also, no meso or micro measures are produced. So the JPC's outline of estimation procedures highlights the absence of more rigorous macro measures. A research paper produced by the JPC emphasizes the importance of meso measures for the education sector, and the concept paper for national productivity policy speaks to the lack of consistent measurement of productivity in public entities. These measures, colleagues, need to be computed if productivity in the public sector is to be effectively targeted. The need to encourage productivity measurement in the private sector by increasing awareness of the value of such measures and thus catalyzing demand, particularly among the MSMEs, is also recognized as an area for which increased focus needs to be placed. The recommended cohesive approach to such sensitization as part of broad holistic efforts has, however, not been actioned. A similar gap exists with regard to the needed national productivity and innovation mindset. The need is acknowledged by the JPC, but the JPC's public education efforts are insufficient. The need for collaborative efforts to catalyze broader utilization of productivity enhancement incentive schemes is also widely acknowledged, but has not been actioned in a cohesive manner. Fostering improvement in public sector productivity is recognized as a critical need. The existing ad hoc initiatives and the JPC support to specific ministry departments and agencies is, however, not in line with the cohesive and coordinated approach that is suggested in the literature. So, colleagues, even if all ministry departments and agencies cannot be addressed simultaneously, a carefully planned and targeted and tiered approach is what is recommended. So numerous recommendations to address each of the gaps just identified have been made in the third chapter of the report. If accepted, these will all require an expanded role for the JPC, and that will be in line with that of numerous national productivity organizations internationally. Such an expansion in role, though, colleagues, must be accompanied by additional human resources as well as financial resources. Move on now to talk about the binding constraints. For each of the 5 binding constraints, the policy review conducted and summarized in chapter 5 of the report evidence that the GOJ is aware of the constraints and the specific sub-issues. Numerous plans and policies initiatives have been implemented across several MDAs and under a number of IDP-supported programs and policies in attempts to address these constraints. So, for example, if you look at education and skill level, there are the comprehensive recommendations made in the first phase JTC report, aka the Patterson report. Those made in the second phase JTC report, specifically addressing TVET, and numerous other initiatives implemented both by the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Science, Energy, and Technology. For crime and corruption, there are the comprehensive Plan Secure Jamaica and the Citizen Security Plan. For the inadequacies in the innovation ecosystem, Because this ecosystem spans numerous areas, there's a wide range of applicable interventions, including the National Science, Technology and Innovation Policy, the JTC report phases 1 and 2, the ICT policy, initiatives implemented by MSET, the GIS, FCGP, NCC, the EECP, EMEP, the Climate Change Policy Framework, the Integrated Resource Plan, the NEC Implementation Plan. Several initiatives implemented. To address the issues of diversification and complexity, the GOJ has implemented initiatives under programs and projects such as the Growth Inducement Strategy, the Foundations for Competitiveness and Growth Project, the Global Services Sector Project, the National Science, Technology and Innovation Policy, and again, the JTC reports phases 1 and 2, and the ICT policy. And for the specific costs of business related to affordable and sustainable energy and trading across borders, the government has implemented the EC National Energy Policy, initiatives implemented by MSET, Integrated Resource Plan, NEC Implementation Plan, initiatives implemented on the GIS, SCGs, GP, and the NCC. So, colleagues, it is important to note that although it is beyond the scope of this report to conduct an in-depth analysis of any of the specific policy interventions for the respective binding constraints, the review of the government's efforts relative to what the literature highlights as current global lessons learned for each of the binding constraints strongly suggests that there is no dearth of understanding of what needs to be done. We know what needs to be done. And the policy direction taken tends to adhere quite well to global exemplars. And the sheer volume of initiatives implemented and plans initiated speak to the seriousness with which the constraints are regarded. The common issue that the GOJ, however, has not yet seemed to grapple with is the complexity and the interconnected nature of the binding constraints and their joint effect on productivity outcomes. And this, colleagues, is the critical gap that has been identified in the 5th chapter of the report. Meaningful, widespread improvement in Jamaica's productivity performance is not likely to be realized if the current piecemeal approach to planning and policy implementation continues. The gap identified has less to do with what is being done and more so to do with how it is being done. And so the last section of the report suggested an adapted systems approach to policy making as a possible solution to this issue, and we'll discuss that momentarily. Let's move directly into the recommendations made, and that will be our final part of this morning's presentation. So several recommendations were made under the respective key areas of focus. So under measuring productivity at the national and sectoral levels, the first order priority was to address the human resource issues affecting staffing to ensure that the JPC has timely access to the data needed to measure and monitor productivity at the national and sectoral levels. The second order priority is to rigorously assess the data collection methods and computational techniques utilized in computing the country's productivity measures against those utilized in countries at the frontier of such methods. In terms of measuring public sector productivity, we have suggested that the JPC and statin should carefully review and cost what is required to allow for rigorous computation of additional macro measures of public sector productivity so that the expected costs can be evaluated against the potential benefits. We also suggest that statin, along with the JPC, should review similar and recent guidelines produced by OECD, UK, etc., to assess the changes that are required to produce meso-level measures of public sector productivity, specifically for the education sector. You have seen just how important the education sector is as a binding constraint to productivity. Of course, if resources are needed, we suggest that statin should be provided with these resources so as to build capacity if necessary. And in terms of the micro measures, we suggest that micro measures of productivity in targeted ministry departments and agencies should be computed. We recommend an approach that was utilized by the New Zealand Productivity Commission. This is the approach that we'll be addressing in the second segment of the training session today. Another key area of focus is encouraging productivity measurement in the private sector. To this end, we suggest sensitization sessions. We suggest that a targeted approach be utilized, so we focus on MSMEs, and it should be organized jointly by the JPC and relevant private sector organizations to highlight the benefits of productivity measurements and to provide practical guidelines as to how managers and small business owners can understand, evaluate, and apply them effectively. Important is to foster a national productivity and innovation mindset. To this end, we suggest that the JPC should work with the Cabinet Office, the Permanent Secretary's Board, private sector organizations to organize joint sensitization sessions where the importance of the characteristics, the tenets, the culture that are conducive to productivity enhancing innovation are emphasized to the private and public sector leaders. And we suggest that a tangible outcome of these sessions should be an agreed communication plan for publicly espousing and advocating the desired characteristics and culture. So as to incentivize productivity in the private sector, we suggest that the JPC should work along with the Ministry of Labour to facilitate discussions between the PSOs and the labour unions intended to catalyze broader utilization of productivity enhancing incentive schemes. The importance of public sector productivity cannot be overemphasized. And so we suggest a tiered approach towards improved public sector productivity, starting with ensuring that productivity improvement is on the ministerial agenda. To this end, JPC should work with the Cabinet Office to organize sensitization sessions where Cabinet ministers are introduced to the role that they can play in promoting productivity enhancing innovation in their ministries, departments, and agencies. We also suggest that the JPC, along with the Cabinet Office, should work with the ministers. Having received that sensitization, they should work with the ministers that are most interested, most ready to fulfill the required role, along with their permanent secretaries, of course, to develop a clear communication and implementation plan. We suggest that no more than 2 or 3 ministries, departments, agencies should be initially selected through this method of self-selection. The phased introduction of public sector productivity measures is also recommended. To do this, the first thing we need to do is what was recommended earlier. The change is needed at starting to enable the provision of data required to compute the more rigorous macro measures of public sector productivity, and the measure for the education sector is recommended. The specific MDAs responsible for trading across borders and energy provision should be targeted in the initial phase of micro-level public sector productivity measurement, along with no more than the 2 to 3 MDAs that we had just mentioned that were selected for quick wins. We suggest that the JPC should provide support to these ministries, departments, and agencies in the design and in the implementation of appropriate measures of productivity, utilizing the approach that we'll be introducing later today. And third, initial efforts should be focused on improving processes and cultures in the 2 public services with cross-cutting impacts. And again, those are what suggested cross-border trade and affordable, sustainable energy. To this end, the JPC should work with MIND to develop training programs for the public sector managers to build capacity in productivity measurement. It should also seek to establish and support a gradually expanding community of practice among the implementing MDAs so as to share knowledge, expertise, etc. After the baseline level of productivity performance is first established with the support of the JPC, then clearly a habit of regular public reporting thereafter should be institutionalized. The JPC should support this habit, and ministerial support in this regard clearly is needed as well. And of course, consistent and rigorous monitoring and evaluation of productivity performance, complemented by assessments of the extent to which outcomes are being achieved, is very important. So the JPC should support the targeted agencies in utilizing the measures computed to identify areas in which improvements are most needed, to assess how things are done with a view to continual innovation in processes, use of technology, and service delivery. The JPC should assist with the targeted agency in terms of assessing their culture with regards to openness to change and innovation. Very important. If any agencies are to improve, to be innovative, to be more productive, these are very important areas that need to be focused on as well. As I said, all of this is going to require enhanced role of the JPC. I think I've lost myself in terms of where I'm on the slides. Right. All of this is going to require enhanced role of the JPC. A critical role that the JPC has to play in this regard is keeping productivity and innovation at the forefront of national discourse. Here we suggest that the JPC should produce quarterly reports highlighting trends in national and sectoral productivity performance over time, and relative to other countries. We recommend that there should be a requirement that these reports be presented to Cabinet so as to keep the matter of productivity fresh on the minds of the government leaders, and they should similarly be formally presented to private sector umbrella organizations. We suggest quarterly press briefings should be convened to present the reports to the public. The report should include reporting on progress made under the proposed tiered public sector improvement program. It should include 4 types of information on the updates on the initiatives being implemented, results of the trend and comparative analysis of the measures of productivity for the education sector, as well as results of the trend analysis on the micro measures of productivity for the specific MDAs being targeted. Of course, we should not ignore the fact that results on broader outcomes are also important as well. It's not just about the outputs and the checking of boxes, but ensuring that productivity measures are being meaningfully improved. The JPC currently has a very useful productivity ambassador program. We suggest that this initiative ought to be expanded. We recommend that private sector ambassadors or champions from each sector should be identified, with a subset being highlighted in each of the quarterly press briefings to show how a focus on productivity has enhanced their operations and profitability. In addition to the quarterly reports, we suggest that there needs to be a comprehensive annual productivity report prepared for submission to Cabinet, to the PSOs, as well as for release to the media. And to support all of this, we suggest that consideration should be given to whether these efforts could be bolstered by a public education campaign. Focus on increasing awareness about the importance of a productivity and innovation mindset in the public and the private sectors. The second and third enhanced roles we have discussed already. The fourth, providing hand-holding support to MSMEs seeking to enhance their productive capacity. This is important, and we suggest that the JPC should initiate discussions with the JBDC as to a potential partnership towards this end. Resourcing of the JPC will have to be sought. We suggest technical assistance should be sought from the country's IDPs to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the organizational structure and staffing of the JPC, considering the enhanced role that is needed for coordination of and support to the national efforts to improve productivity in the public and the private sectors. And this assessment should focus on the number, the level, the expertise of the staff required, the technological requirements, as well as on the budgetary allocations needed. All right, colleagues, I get a strong sense in the room that persons are tired and we need to get up and stretch. I have 2 more slides. So we're going to get up and stretch. Persons in teams, you can also get up and stretch. We have about 2 or 3 more slides and then we're done. All right, let me lead the way. Let's just get stretched. Let us stretch.
Those online can get up and stretch, right, David?
I encourage you to do so.
But good presentation so far.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, whatever again.
No, I want to stretch my mouth. Hi, David.
Hello. I'm not seeing cameras now, so if you identify yourself, who is this?
Reginald, what took you so long?
Good presentation, David. Good as usual. Very
Thank
comprehensive work.
Oh, Mr. Budan. No, I catch the
Yes.
voice. Good to hear you again, Mr. Budan.
I will make my comments afterward.
All right.
But good work. Good work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, we just have about 3 slides remaining. So bear with me, colleagues. Let's just wrap this up. All right, so we want to move on now to look at the proposed approach to addressing the binding constraints to productivity, which we saw as being very, very important. We want to start by acknowledging a key feature of the context which we are faced. So colleagues, if you look at the screen, the figure on the left illustrates the complexity surrounding productivity in Jamaica. The overlapping nature of the binding constraints indicates it's impossible to make meaningful progress in some of the constraints without addressing others. So this leads to a policy context, which is illustrated in the figure on the right, where there are several interdependencies and codependencies between various interventions, which, if not properly understood, can lead to stifled or even perverse outcomes. So the policy approach currently utilized in regard to productivity in Jamaica would basically be described as a more or less joined up collection of policies intended to try and stimulate productivity growth. And this is not unique to Jamaica at all. The literature identifies or indicates that new approaches to policy making and implementation are needed. So we have shown in the report the recent evolution of a number of government's approaches towards productivity policy away from siloed policy formulation towards cross-thematic and cross-institutional approaches. So international experience suggests that the creation of cross-departmental analytical and policy delivery teams in a joined-up whole-of-government approach to formulating productivity-enhancing policies is a critical step towards improved outcomes. A reframing of government thinking about productivity policy in a more holistic manner by looking for the intersections and interdependencies between policy and thematic silos is a critical further condition for success. Colleagues, policy spaces, as you well know, are complex. Systems approaches focus on mapping and explaining systems or processes that are characterized by complexity. So they aim to explain how and why system-wide behavior emerges from the interaction between large numbers of smaller, often interdependent components. So the systems approach is what is being increasingly advocated as the modality through which such thinking can be institutionalized through an iterative modeling and learning process. But as with anything else, colleagues, there are challenges to the utilization of such an approach, which gave us pause in the recommendation of the wholesale adoption of the systems approach in Jamaica. We instead suggested an incremental approach. Our recommendation for an adapted systems approach to productivity policy in Jamaica includes first team building, where a new cross-departmental analytical and productivity policy delivery team is established and properly resourced to lead the policy design, analysis, implementation, and review process. We suggest that the team should be comprised of public sector managers and policy analysts with a track record of innovative, results-oriented thinking, openness to new approaches, willingness to learn, to push the boundaries, expertise in collaborative problem solving, and with a commitment to improve performance. I think we suggest that because of the important cross-cutting nature of the productivity problem, both in the public and the private sectors, the best human resources across the government we suggest should be sought to man this team. And we also suggest this could also include secondments from the private sector as well. The team should be explicitly tasked with providing rigorous responses to a set of questions designed at getting to the core of the causal relations driving productivity and the binding constraints thereto, the interdependencies between them, and the impact of measures being considered on other elements of the system in which they are being implemented. Again, we suggest that it should be done in a truly whole-of-government environment, free of traditional ministry, department, spheres of influence and operation. Secondly, we suggest capacity building, where the team that is created is given the exposure to systems thinking and training in the tools and methods used in the systems approach. This will give the team the systems frame of reference when conducting their policy analysis and design. We suggest that technical assistance from the country's IDPs could be sought to aid in sourcing and funding international expertise required for such training and sensitization. Designing a system of monitoring and evaluation through the formulation, use, and monitoring of carefully conceived output and outcome indicators which target continual learning and policy improvement is also critical. We suggest that feedback loops are to be incorporated as critical elements of the policy design and implementation process, where information is actively sought to allow for revision and refinement of interventions. We suggest that the team driving the process must be given the flexibility to adjust and change course when the feedback received dictates this. The ability to adapt and change to a dynamic and complex environment is a critical prerequisite for success in productivity enhancing policy formulation. And finally, we suggest that we need to ensure that the leadership at the respective levels are fully on board and committed not only to the targeted outcomes, but also to the approach and the processes being adopted. So we suggest that the newly created team needs to be able to reach across several different ministries, departments, and agencies to make time-bound demands of them. It therefore needs to have the full imprimatur of the cabinet, possibly even the prime minister. It would also benefit from having an oversight body like the National Competitiveness Council or even the council itself. The body will not only serve to hold the team accountable, but will also give it the gravitas to demand what is required of the MDAs and other stakeholders. So, colleagues, to wrap up the presentation, let me conclude by noting that the most glaring deficiency identified in this report with regards to the efforts to enhance productivity in the country relates to the need to adopt a cohesive and coordinated approach to the issue. This approach will need to recognize and address the deep-seated binding constraints to productivity, as well as to catalyze efforts to improve the extent to which productivity is measured, monitored, and managed. I have spoken for a lot. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much for listening. And the floor is now open. So, Mr. Budan, the floor is now open. Would you have anything to say at this point?
Well, I'd like others to comment first.
All right.